Victoria Ashford stood in her penthouse living room, watching the city lights twinkle 47 floors below. Everything had to be perfect tonight. The crystal glasses were positioned exactly 3 inches apart on the marble bar. The flower arrangements cost more than most people's monthly rent. Even the temperature was set to precisely 68 degrees. She checked her watch. The guests would arrive in 30 minutes. Investors from Singapore, a hedge fund manager from London, and a tech mogul from Silicon Valley. These weren't just dinner guests. They were potential partners in her latest venture, a project that could add another billion to her already massive fortune. Mrs. Ashford? A gentle voice broke her concentration. Victoria turned to see Rosa, her housekeeper of 12 years, standing near the kitchen doorway. The woman looked tired, as she always did at the end of a long day. Victoria had never really thought about it before. "Yes, what is it?" Victoria asked, already turning back to inspect the dining table setup. "I just wanted to confirm that everything is ready. The catering staff will arrive in 20 minutes. I can stay to supervise if you need me to." "That's fine, Rosa. You can leave once they arrive. I'm sure you're eager to get home." Rosa nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. Victoria barely noticed. Her mind was running through the evening's agenda, the talking points she needed to hit, the subtle ways she'd showcase her success without appearing too eager. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of final preparations. The caterers arrived with their equipment and ingredients. Victoria walked them through her expectations, her tone leaving no room for error. She'd built a $4 billion company by paying attention to details, and she wasn't about to let a dinner party slip below her standards. She was adjusting a napkin for the 3rd time when she noticed a young man sitting in the far corner of the entrance hall. He was maybe 19 or 20, wearing a simple jacket that had seen better days. His shoes were worn at the edges. He sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, looking completely out of place among the luxury surrounding him. "Rosa?" Victoria called out, a hint of annoyance in her voice. "Who is that?" Rosa emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Oh, that's my son, Daniel. He's giving me a ride home tonight. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashford. He'll wait outside if you prefer." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "It's fine. Just keep him out of the way." But then something occurred to her. She glanced at her grand piano, a stunning Steinway that dominated the far end of the living room. She'd paid $2.5 million for it at an auction. It was a masterpiece, a conversation piece, a symbol of her refined taste. There was just one problem. Victoria couldn't play a single note. She'd planned to have her usual pianist perform during the cocktail hour, but he'd canceled that morning due to a family emergency. The evening felt incomplete without music. Live piano always impressed her guests, made them feel like they were experiencing something special. Victoria looked at the young man again, then back at the piano. Why not? These working-class kids usually learned a few simple songs. Maybe he could play something basic. It would be charming in a way, authentic. Her guests might even find it endearing. "Rosa, does your son play piano?" Victoria asked, an idea forming in her mind. Rosa looked surprised. "Well, yes, he does. He's been playing since he was 5. "Perfect." Victoria walked over to where Daniel sat. He stood up quickly, respectfully, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Daniel, is it?" Victoria said, her tone the same one she used when delegating tasks to junior employees. "I understand you play piano." "Yes, ma'am." "I do. Wonderful. I need someone to play during cocktail hour tonight. Nothing fancy, just some background music. Can you handle that?" Daniel hesitated. "I've studied piano quite seriously, Mrs. Ashford. What kind of music were you thinking?" Victoria cut him off with a laugh. "Oh, don't worry about it being perfect. Just play whatever you know. Something pleasant. My usual pianist had to cancel and I need someone to fill in. You'd be doing me a favor." She could see him struggling with how to respond. His mother stood nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But Victoria was already moving on in her mind, pleased with herself for solving the problem so efficiently. "The guests will start arriving in about 10 minutes, Victoria continued. "Just sit at the piano and play. Keep it soft, nothing too dramatic." "Can you do that?" "I can play," Daniel said quietly. "But I should mention that I attend." "Great, that's settled then." Victoria turned away, already thinking about her next task. "Rosa, make sure he's ready before you leave." The doorbell rang and Victoria's attention shifted completely. Her first guests had arrived. She smoothed her dress, put on her most winning smile, and went to greet them. Over the next 15 minutes, the penthouse filled with exactly the kind of people Victoria wanted to impress. Richard Chen, whose investment firm managed $30 billion in assets. Patricia Williams, who'd just sold her startup for $800 million. James Thornton, whose tech empire rivaled Victoria's own. They gathered in the living room, champagne in hand, discussing market trends and acquisition opportunities. Victoria was in her element, steering conversations, making connections, positioning herself for the deals she wanted to close. "Shall we have some music?" she announced, gesturing toward the piano. "I have a special treat for you tonight. Something authentic and unexpected." She caught Daniel's eye and nodded. He'd been standing near the piano, and now he walked over to the bench and sat down. Victoria noticed several of her guests exchange amused glances. She could read their thoughts. They were looking at his worn jacket, his nervous demeanor, his youth. They thought this was some kind of novelty, a quirky choice on Victoria's part. Patricia leaned over to Victoria and whispered, "Where did you find him? Is this one of those feel-good hiring initiatives?" Victoria smiled but didn't answer. Let them think what they wanted. The point was to have some pleasant background music while they talked business. "Everyone, this is Daniel," Victoria announced. "He's going to play for us tonight." A small smattering of polite applause followed. The guests turned back to their conversations, expecting nothing more than ambient sound. Daniel sat at the piano, his posture straightening. He placed his hands on the keys, and Victoria noticed something shift in his expression. The nervousness disappeared, replaced by something else. Concentration, purpose, certainty. Victoria raised her glass to Richard, about to resume their discussion about quarterly projections. But then the first notes filled the room and something made her pause. This wasn't simple background music. The sound that came from the piano was powerful, complex, and absolutely stunning. Daniel's hands moved across the keys with impossible speed and precision, producing a cascade of notes that seemed to paint pictures in the air. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Richard's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. Patricia turned fully toward the piano, her eyes wide. Every person in the room fell silent, transfixed. Victoria felt her face flush. This wasn't what she'd expected at all. This young man she'd dismissed as someone who could play a little something was performing at a level she'd only heard in concert halls. The piece was demanding, intricate, and he was executing it flawlessly. She'd made a terrible mistake in judgment, and everyone in the room was witnessing it. The music filled every corner of the penthouse. Daniel's fingers flew across the keys, moving so fast they were almost a blur. The piece he was playing demanded everything from a pianist. Lightning-quick runs up and down the keyboard. Thundering chords that made the crystal glasses on the bar vibrate. Delicate passages that sounded like whispers in the dark. Victoria stood frozen, her champagne glass still raised in the air from the toast she'd been about to make. She couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Around her, the most powerful people in the business world had gone completely silent. Richard Chen, the billionaire investor who prided himself on never being surprised, had his mouth hanging slightly open. Patricia Williams had actually taken a step closer to the piano, drawn by the sheer magnetism of the performance. James Thornton had pulled out his phone and was recording, something he never did at private gatherings. The piece was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Victoria didn't know that. She'd never had time for classical music education, despite owning one of the world's most expensive pianos. But Patricia knew. She'd been a pianist herself before business school, and she recognized one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for piano. "My God," Patricia whispered. "That's the Rach 3. Daniel's whole body moved with the music. His shoulders swayed, his back curved and straightened. His feet worked the pedals with precise timing. This wasn't just technical skill. This was artistry. This was years of dedicated practice, natural talent, and deep understanding all coming together. The difficult passages that made professional pianists nervous, Daniel played as if they were nothing. His left hand created a foundation of powerful bass notes while his right hand danced through melodies that seemed impossible. There were moments when it sounded like 3 or 4 people playing at once. Victoria felt heat rising to her face. She'd asked him to play something pleasant for background music. She'd waved off his attempt to explain his experience. She'd treated him like someone who knew a few simple songs, maybe some popular tunes or basic classical pieces. Rosa stood near the kitchen door, tears streaming down her face. She was watching her son do what he was born to do, in front of people who finally understood his gift. But Victoria could see something else in Rosa's expression too. Embarrassment for her employer, sadness at how her son had been dismissed, the music built to a climax. Daniel's hands crashed down on the keys in a series of powerful chords that seemed to shake the floor. Then suddenly it ended. The final notes hung in the air like stars. Silence. Complete and total silence. It lasted for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. Daniel sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his breathing slightly heavy from the physical exertion of the performance. Then the applause started. It wasn't polite cocktail party applause. It was the kind of applause you hear at concert halls after a historic performance. Richard started it, clapping loudly and without reservation. Patricia joined in, then James, then everyone else. They weren't just clapping. Several people were saying bravo and incredible. Daniel stood up from the piano bench and gave a small, humble bow. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, even though he'd just proven himself beyond any doubt. Victoria finally found her voice. She walked toward the piano, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Everyone fell quiet again, watching to see what she would say. That was, she started, then stopped. What could she say? That it was nice? That it was pleasant? The words she'd used before seemed insultingly small now. That was extraordinary. Daniel nodded politely. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. Where did you learn to play like that? Victoria asked. The question came out wrong, almost accusatory, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. I've been studying piano since I was 5, Daniel said. My mother saved for years to buy me a used keyboard. I practiced every day after school. Rosa stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel attends Juilliard, Mrs. Ashford. He's in his 2nd year. Full scholarship. Victoria felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Juilliard, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. A full scholarship meant he'd beaten out thousands of talented applicants. And she'd asked him to provide background music like he was someone hired off the street. Juilliard, Victoria repeated, the word feeling heavy in her mouth. Yes, ma'am, Daniel said. I tried to mention it earlier, but you were busy. Patricia stepped forward, her eyes bright with excitement. That was the Rachmaninoff Third, wasn't it? I haven't heard it played that well outside of Carnegie Hall. Daniel smiled, a real smile this time. Yes, it's one of my favorite pieces. I performed it last month at a student recital. Student recital? James laughed in disbelief. Son, that was professional level. Better than professional. I've been to concerts that didn't move me like that just did. Other guests gathered around Daniel, peppering him with questions. Had he performed publicly? What other pieces did he know? Who was his teacher? Daniel answered each question with patience and humility, clearly more comfortable discussing music than receiving praise. Victoria stood back, watching the scene unfold. Her guests, people who usually only cared about stock prices and market share, were genuinely excited about music, about art, about this young man she'd barely looked at before tonight. Richard pulled Victoria aside. Where have you been hiding him? That young man could have a major career ahead of him. I didn't know, Victoria said quietly. I had no idea. You didn't know your housekeeper's son is a concert-level pianist? Richard raised an eyebrow. Have you never asked about her family? The question hit harder than he probably intended. Victoria realized she couldn't name a single fact about Rosa's life outside of work. 12 years of employment and she knew nothing. Not Rosa's birthday, not where she lived, not her dreams or struggles or the sacrifices she'd made to raise a prodigy. James was still filming. This is going to get some attention, he said almost to himself. A kid this talented needs to be known. Please don't post that, Victoria said quickly, but James wasn't listening to her. Patricia had pulled out her phone too. Several other guests were recording or taking photos. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable with all the attention. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a reassuring nod. I should probably let you all get back to your dinner, Daniel said politely. I didn't mean to interrupt your evening. Interrupt? Richard laughed. Young man, you just gave us the highlight of the month. Maybe the year. Victoria walked over to Daniel. Up close, she could see how young he really was. 19, maybe 20. Still figuring out life, working jobs to help his mother while pursuing his dreams at one of the hardest schools in the country. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said. The words felt foreign in her mouth. She wasn't used to apologizing, especially not in front of her business associates. "I made assumptions about you. I didn't take the time to listen when you tried to tell me about your experience." Daniel looked at her, and for a moment, Victoria saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not even satisfaction at proving her wrong. It was patience, understanding, the same expression he'd had when she dismissed him earlier. "It's okay, Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Most people don't expect much from me when they first meet me. I'm used to it." Those words stung worse than any accusation could have. He was used to it. Used to being underestimated. Used to people judging him by his worn jacket and his mother's job instead of his talent and dedication. Rosa appeared at Daniel's side. "We should go. You have class early tomorrow." As they walked toward the door, Victoria's guests continued praising Daniel. Richard pressed a business card into his hand. Patricia asked for his contact information. James was already posting the video online. Victoria watched them leave, her perfectly planned evening completely derailed. But she couldn't focus on her guests anymore. All she could think about was the expression on Daniel's face when he'd said, "I'm used to it." The door closed behind them, and Victoria realized something had shifted. She'd spent the whole evening worried about making the right impression on her guests. But the real impression had been made by someone she'd barely noticed. Victoria couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her king-sized bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over in her mind. The dinner had continued after Daniel and Rosa left. The business deals had been discussed. The contracts would probably be signed. By all measures, the evening had been a success. But all Victoria could think about was Daniel's face. The way he'd said, "I'm used to it," without bitterness or anger. Just acceptance. As if being underestimated was simply part of his daily life. At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went to her office. She opened her laptop and typed Daniel's name into the search bar, adding Juilliard and piano. The results made her stomach twist. There were articles about him from 2 years ago. Local teen wins prestigious Gilmore Young Artist Award. The award came with $50,000 in recognition as one of the most promising young pianists in the country. He'd been 17. Victoria clicked on a video from the competition. Daniel, 2 years younger and even more nervous looking, sitting at a piano on a big stage. Then he started playing, and that same transformation happened. The shy teenager disappeared, replaced by an artist in complete control of his craft. The comments under the video were glowing. Professional musicians praising his technique. Teachers saying they'd never seen someone so young play with such maturity. One comment from a famous concert pianist, "Watch this young man. He's going to be one of the greats." Victoria found more videos. Performances from high school concerts. A local news segment about his acceptance to Juilliard. An interview where he talked about his mother working multiple jobs to support his dreams. How she'd never missed a single recital even when she was exhausted. "My mom is my hero," Daniel had said in the interview, his voice full of emotion. "She believed in me when we had nothing. She still believes in me." Victoria closed the laptop and put her head in her hands. Rosa had worked for her for 12 years. 12 years of cleaning her home, organizing her life, making everything run smoothly. And Victoria had never once asked about Rosa's son. Never asked what Rosa was proud of. Never treated her as anything more than someone who worked for her. The next morning, Victoria was already awake when her phone started buzzing. Text messages, emails, notifications flooding in. She picked up the phone and felt her heart sink. James had posted the video. It was everywhere. "Billionaire's Maid son stuns party with piano performance," read one headline. The video had 3 million views already and was climbing fast. Victoria scrolled through the comments, and they weren't kind to her. Look at how shocked she is. Like she can't believe someone like him could have talent. The way she asked him to play something pleasant, like he was going to play chopsticks. Rich. People really think they're better than everyone else. This is what classism looks like in real time. Some comments were worse. Much worse. People were analyzing every expression on her face during the video. Every word she'd said. They'd even found old interviews where she'd talked about success being about hard work, completely ignoring her own privileged background. Her phone rang. It was her PR team panicking. They'd already drafted 3 different statements for her to release. Each one tried to spin the situation differently, but they all rang hollow. Victoria told them she'd call back and hung up. She didn't want a PR strategy. She didn't want to spin this into something it wasn't. For the first time in years, she wanted to face something directly without calculating the business impact. She called Rosa's number. It rang 4 times before Rosa answered. "Hello, Mrs. Ashford?" Rosa's voice was cautious. "Rosa, I need to talk to you. Can you come by today?" "Not to work," Victoria added quickly. "Just to talk." There was a long pause. "Is this about the video?" "Partly. But mostly I owe you and Daniel an apology. A real one. Not for the cameras or for damage control. Just because it's the right thing to do." Another pause. "I can come this afternoon. Daniel has classes all day." They met in Victoria's living room, the same room where Daniel had played 3 nights before. Rosa sat on the edge of the couch, still uncomfortable despite Victoria's insistence that she relax. "I've worked for you for 12 years, Victoria started, "and I just realized last night that I don't know anything about you." "Not really. I don't know your birthday. I don't know your dreams. I didn't know about Daniel's talent until he sat at that piano." Rosa looked down at her hands. "You were always kind to me, Mrs. Ashford. You paid well. You never yelled or treated me badly." "But I didn't see you," Victoria said. "I didn't see Daniel. I looked right through both of you like you were invisible. And that's worse than being unkind. That's being completely indifferent. Daniel said you apologized that night. I did. But I don't think I really understood what I was apologizing for until I went home and couldn't sleep." "Rosa, how did you do it? How did you raise a son with that much talent while working full-time?" Rosa was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I had 2 jobs for most of Daniel's childhood. I cleaned houses during the day and worked at a restaurant at night. Daniel's piano teacher, Mr. Chen, he gave us a huge discount because he saw Daniel's potential. Sometimes he taught him for free. The keyboard I bought him when he was 7 I saved for 2 years. It was used, missing some keys that didn't work right. But Daniel practiced on it for hours every day. He'd finish his homework, then go straight to that broken keyboard." Victoria felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. "The Gilmore Award. The $50,000. What did Daniel do with it?" "He wanted to give it all to me," Rosa said, a small smile crossing her face. "To pay me back for everything." Can you imagine? This 17-year-old boy trying to give his mother $50,000. I told him absolutely not. That money was for his education, his future. We compromised. He kept most of it for Juilliard expenses, but he insisted on paying off my car loan. He said it would help him focus on school knowing I didn't have that debt hanging over me. Victoria had to look away. She'd spent $50,000 on a handbag last month without thinking twice. "The video that's going around," Rosa continued. "Daniel called me this morning. He's upset about it. Not because of what happened, but because of what people are saying about you." "About me?" Victoria was surprised. "He's defending me?" "He said you made a mistake, but you apologized. He said the people commenting don't know you, don't know the whole story. He wanted me to tell you not to worry about it." Victoria laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "He's defending me after I treated him like that?" "That's who my son is," Rosa said simply. "I raised him to see the good in people, to be patient with their flaws because everyone has them." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside, something was shifting that couldn't be measured in stock prices or property values. "Rosa, I want to help. I want to do something meaningful, not just throw money at the situation to make myself feel better, but I don't know what that looks like." Rosa thought for a long time. "You know how many families like mine are out there? Parents working 2-3 jobs with children who have incredible talents they can't afford to develop? Daniel got lucky. His teacher saw his gift and helped us, but most kids don't get that chance. What if there was a way to help those kids?" Rosa continued. "Not just with money for lessons, but with everything they need. Instruments, transportation, competition fees, all of it. What if someone with your resources created something that gave them the same opportunities rich kids have?" Victoria leaned forward. "A foundation. A real one, not just a tax write-off. For children of people who work in service industries. Housekeepers, drivers, restaurant workers, all of them." "Exactly," Rosa said. "You asked what you could do. That's what you could do. Not for me or Daniel. We're going to be okay. But for all the other families out there who have dreams but no way to reach them." Victoria pulled out her phone and started making notes. 50 million to start. A selection committee that included people who understood these families' struggles, scholarships that covered not just tuition but living expenses, so talented kids didn't have to choose between their education and helping their families. "I want you on the committee," Victoria said. "You understand what these families need better than any board of directors ever could." Rosa looked uncertain. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm not qualified for something like that. You raised one of the most talented pianists I've ever heard while working multiple jobs and keeping your family together. You're more qualified than anyone I know." They talked for 2 more hours. About the foundation, yes, but also about their lives. Victoria learned that Rosa loved gardening but had no yard. That she'd always dreamed of visiting Italy. That her own mother had been a singer but never got the chance to pursue it professionally. Rosa learned that Victoria's parents had died when she was young, leaving her their company. That she'd thrown herself into work to avoid dealing with grief. That she sometimes went days without having a real conversation with anyone. When Rosa left that afternoon, something had changed. Not everything. Victoria was still a billionaire and Rosa was still her employee. But they'd seen each other. Really seen each other. And that was a start. 3 months passed. Victoria threw herself into creating the foundation with the same intensity she'd once reserved for building her company. But this time, something was different. She wasn't just signing checks and letting other people handle the details. She was involved in every decision, every policy, every choice about how the money would be spent. The foundation offices took up an entire floor in one of Victoria's buildings. But unlike her corporate offices with their cold glass and steel, this space felt warm. There were comfortable chairs, artwork from local students on the walls, and a small performance space where scholarship recipients could practice and perform. Rosa came to the office 3 times a week, working alongside the professional staff Victoria had hired. At first, the staff didn't know what to make of her. A housekeeper on the selection committee? But Rosa's perspective quickly proved invaluable. "This application says the family makes $40,000 a year," Rosa said during one meeting, pointing to a form. "That sounds like enough to help with music lessons, right?" The staff members nodded. It seemed reasonable. "It's not," Rosa continued. "Not if they're paying rent in the city. Not if there are medical bills or other children. Not if they're trying to save anything for emergencies. I know because I lived it. We need to look at the whole picture, not just a number on paper." She was right. Again and again, Rosa caught things the professional staff missed. The hidden costs of pursuing excellence. The transportation challenges. The way poverty wasn't just about money but about time and energy, and the constant stress of never having enough of any of it. Victoria watched and learned. She started attending the scholarship interviews herself, something the staff initially protested. Billionaires didn't usually sit in on routine selection meetings. But Victoria insisted. "Tell me about your daughter's singing," Victoria said to a woman who cleaned offices downtown. The woman's hand shook as she held her coffee cup. She clearly wasn't used to sitting across from someone like Victoria. "She has the voice of an angel," the mother said quietly. "Since she was tiny, she's been singing. The church choir director says she's never heard natural talent like that." "But?" Victoria prompted gently. She'd learned there was always a but. "But voice lessons cost money we don't have. The choir is free, but to really train her voice to learn properly, she needs a real teacher. And then there are the competitions, the travel costs if she gets accepted." The woman's voice trailed off. "I want so badly to give her this chance." Victoria looked at the application. The daughter was 14. Her grades were excellent despite going to an underfunded school. Her choir director had written a recommendation that glowed with praise. The family made $32,000 a year with 3 children. "She's in," Victoria said. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Really? Just like that?" "Just like that." Victoria smiled. "Your daughter is exactly who we created this foundation for. Someone with extraordinary talent who just needs the right support to bloom." After the woman left, Rosa turned to Victoria. "You've changed," she said simply. "Have I?" Victoria asked. 3 months ago, you wouldn't have seen that woman. You would have looked through her the same way you looked through me for 12 years. Now you're really listening to her story. You're seeing her daughter as a person, not just an application." Victoria nodded slowly. "I'm trying. I still mess up. Last week I almost suggested one of the families should just move to a cheaper neighborhood, and one of your team members had to explain why that wasn't realistic." Rosa laughed. "But you listened when they explained. That's what matters. You're learning. The foundation awarded its first 100 scholarships 2 weeks later. Musicians, dancers, artists, writers, children whose parents worked as housekeepers, construction workers, delivery drivers, restaurant staff, kids who had talent but no pathway to develop it. But Victoria realized the foundation was only part of what needed to change. She started looking at her own company, her own practices. How many talented people had she overlooked because they didn't fit her narrow definition of success? She called a meeting with her HR director. I want to change our hiring practices. I want us to actively recruit from community colleges, not just elite universities. I want to create pathways for people without traditional backgrounds. The HR director looked skeptical. Mrs. Ashford, with respect, we have standards to maintain. I'm not lowering standards, Victoria said firmly. I'm expanding where we look for talent. Some of the smartest people I know never had the chance to go to fancy schools. That doesn't make them less capable. She thought of Daniel, practicing for hours on a broken keyboard. Talent didn't come from privilege. It came from dedication and passion and, yes, natural ability. But it needed opportunity to flourish. Victoria also changed things closer to home. She started having lunch with her household staff once a month. Not formal meetings, just conversations. She learned that her driver's son wanted to be an engineer. Her cook's daughter was studying to be a nurse. The woman who managed her schedules was writing a novel in her spare time. These were people she'd seen nearly every day for years, and she'd never known any of this. One afternoon, Daniel came to visit the foundation offices. He'd been hesitant to get involved, not wanting it to seem like the foundation was just about him. But Rosa had convinced him to at least see what they'd built. Victoria showed him around, proud of what they'd accomplished in just a few months. The practice rooms, the scholarship recipients' photos on the wall, the stack of new applications coming in every day. This is amazing, Daniel said, looking around. All these kids getting chances they wouldn't have had otherwise. They ended up in Victoria's office, drinking coffee and talking. It was the first real conversation they'd had since that night at the piano. I need to tell you something, Victoria said. I've been wanting to say it for months, but I wanted to wait until the foundation was really working, until it was real and not just a nice idea. Daniel waited. That night when you played at my party, you could have been angry. You could have refused, or made me feel small for underestimating you. But you didn't. You just sat down and played with everything you had. You showed me who you were through your music instead of through anger or resentment. That changed something in me, Victoria continued. It made me realize that I'd been looking at the world in the most limited, shallow way possible. And I'm grateful to you for that lesson, even though you didn't set out to teach it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? That night was hard for me. Not because you underestimated me. Like I said, I'm used to that. It was hard because I could see my mom's face. I could see her embarrassment that her employer didn't even know about her son's life. My mom has sacrificed everything for me. She's worked herself to exhaustion so I could have lessons and opportunities. And watching someone treat her like she was invisible, like her life and her son didn't matter enough to even ask about, that hurt worse than any assumption about me. Victoria felt the words like a physical blow. I'm so sorry. To both of you. I know you are, Daniel said, and I can see you're trying to do better. This foundation, the changes you're making, those matter. But what matters more is that you're seeing people now. You're listening to their stories. My mom told me about your conversations, about how you asked about her life, her dreams. That meant more to her than any foundation could, because it meant you finally saw her as a whole person, not just someone who worked for you. They talked until the sun started setting. Daniel told her about Juilliard, about the pressure and the competition and the joy of being surrounded by people who understood his passion. Victoria told him about her own struggles, about building a company so focused on success that she'd forgotten why success mattered in the first place. You know what's funny? Daniel said as he was getting ready to leave. That video going viral was the best thing that could have happened. Not because it gave me exposure, though that's been nice, but because it held up a mirror to something a lot of people needed to see. Including me, Victoria said. Especially you, Daniel agreed with a small smile. But the thing about mirrors is, they show you what you look like so you can decide if that's who you want to be. And you decided to change. That takes courage. After Daniel left, Victoria sat in her office watching the city lights come on. The foundation had 100 scholarship recipients now. Next year they planned to support 300, then more. As many as they could reach. but more than the numbers, what mattered was the shift in herself, in how she moved through the world, in her willingness to see people she'd once looked through. She thought about the gala they were planning for next month. Daniel had agreed to perform, a real performance this time, properly introduced, properly honored, and Victoria would be in the audience, not networking or planning her next deal, but actually listening, really listening. The night of the gala arrived 6 months after that dinner party that had changed everything. The venue was Lincoln Center, one of the most prestigious performance spaces in the world. Victoria had insisted on nothing less for the foundation's official launch. But unlike her usual events, this gala wasn't about impressing investors or closing deals. The guest list included the scholarship families, their children, the teachers and mentors who'd believed in these kids when no one else did. Yes, there were wealthy donors too, but they were here to support something bigger than themselves. Victoria stood backstage, more nervous than she'd been in years. She was about to give a speech, and for once she hadn't hired someone to write it for her. These words needed to be her own. Rosa found her there, looking elegant in a dress Victoria had insisted on buying her. Rosa had protested, of course, but Victoria had been firm. Tonight, Rosa wasn't staff. She was co-founder of the foundation and the person whose wisdom had shaped everything they'd built. "You look terrified," Rosa said with a knowing smile. "I am," Victoria admitted. "I've given hundreds of speeches, product launches, investor meetings, conferences, but this feels different." "That's because this time you're speaking from your heart instead of your business plan," Rosa said. "It's scarier but better." The auditorium was filling up. Victoria peeked through the curtain and saw the scholarship families taking their seats. A young violinist she'd met last month, sitting between his parents who both worked at a hotel, the teenage dancer whose mother cleaned houses, the boy who painted with such raw emotion that it made Victoria's chest ache, his father beside him still wearing his delivery company uniform because he'd come straight from work. And there, in the third row, was Daniel. He'd be performing later, but first he was here as Rosa's son, supporting his mother's moment in the spotlight. The lights dimmed. It was time. Victoria walked onto the stage and the applause was warm but uncertain. Many people here had seen that viral video. They knew her story, knew her mistakes. She didn't blame them for their skepticism. 6 months ago, Victoria began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I made a mistake that changed my life. I looked at a talented young man and saw only his worn jacket and his mother's job. I asked him to play piano for my guests, expecting simple background music. What I got was a masterclass in humility." She paused, finding Daniel in the audience. Daniel played that night like his life depended on it. Not to prove me wrong, though he certainly did that, but because that's who he is. Someone who gives everything to his art, regardless of who's watching or what they expect. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Not because I was embarrassed, though I was, but because I realized I'd spent years building a fortune, while remaining completely blind to the people around me. I'd looked through my housekeeper for 12 years without seeing her, without knowing about her sacrifices, her dreams, or her extraordinary son. Victoria saw some people in the audience nodding, others still looked doubtful. I can't undo 12 years of not paying attention. I can't take back all the times I treated people as invisible, simply because they worked for me instead of with me. But I can do better going forward. We all can, she gestured to the audience. This foundation isn't about easing my guilt. It's about recognizing a truth I should have seen years ago. Talent exists everywhere. Genius exists everywhere. But opportunity doesn't, and that's not just unfair. It's a loss for all of us. How much art are we missing because the artist couldn't afford supplies? How much music goes unheard because the musician had no instrument? How many brilliant minds never develop because poverty exhausts them before they can bloom? Victoria's voice grew stronger. The 100 families here tonight represent just the beginning. These children have gifts the world needs to hear, to see, to experience, and their parents have worked themselves to exhaustion to give them whatever chances they could. That dedication, that sacrifice, that deserves support. She looked directly at Rosa. I want to introduce you to the real heart of this foundation. Rosa Martinez has worked as a housekeeper for 25 years. She raised a son who's now at Juilliard. She did it while working 2 jobs, while budgeting every penny, while never once complaining about how hard it was. When I asked her how we could really help families like hers, she didn't think about herself. She thought about all the other parents out there struggling the way she struggled, dreaming the way she dreamed. "Rosa, please come up here." Rosa looked startled. This wasn't part of the plan. But she stood and made her way to the stage, and the applause grew louder. "Tell them," Victoria said softly when Rosa reached her side. "Tell them what you told me that day in my living room." Rosa took a moment to compose herself. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "I told Mrs. Ashford that my son got lucky. His piano teacher saw his gift and helped us when we had nothing to give in return. But most families don't get that lucky. Most talented kids never get the chance to develop their gifts because their parents are too busy surviving to help them thrive. I wanted Mrs. Ashford to understand that there are thousands of children out there like Daniel, children with extraordinary abilities and parents who would give anything to support them but simply can't. Not because they don't care, but because the system isn't built for people like us." Rosa's voice grew stronger. "This foundation won't fix everything, but it will give some families the chance mine got. The chance to say yes when our children discover their passion. The chance to help them reach for dreams that seem impossible. And maybe along the way, it will remind all of us to look at each other differently, to see each other fully." The applause was thunderous now. People were standing. Some were crying. After the speeches, there was a reception, but the main event was still to come. Daniel's performance. Victoria sat in the audience this time, not backstage networking. Rosa sat beside her. Around them were the scholarship families, donors, and supporters. But Victoria wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about how 6 months ago she'd heard Daniel play and been shocked. Tonight she would hear him play and be grateful. The lights dimmed again. Daniel walked onto the stage, and this time the introduction was proper. His accomplishments, his training, his talent, all acknowledged fully. He sat at the piano, and Victoria noticed his hands were steady. He belonged here. He'd always belonged here. The piece he played was different from that night at her penthouse. This one was softer, more intimate. It spoke of journeys and struggle and hope. It spoke of mothers who sacrificed everything and children who worked twice as hard because they knew what those sacrifices cost. Victoria found tears running down her face. Not from sadness, but from the beauty of it. And from gratitude that she'd been given the chance to change, to grow, to become someone who could appreciate this moment fully. When the music ended, the standing ovation lasted for 3 full minutes. Daniel bowed, smiling that genuine smile Victoria had rarely seen from him. He gestured to his mother in the audience, and Rosa stood, wiping her own tears. Later at the reception, Victoria watched the scholarship families mingling with donors. She saw one of the fathers, still in his work uniform, talking with a wealthy tech executive about his daughter's painting. The executive was listening intently, genuinely interested. She saw the young violinist playing an impromptu piece for a group of admirers. She saw connections forming that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Rosa appeared at her side with 2 glasses of champagne. "We did it," she said simply. "You did it," Victoria corrected. "I just finally learned to listen." "Maybe that's the most important part," Rosa said. "The listening." They stood together, watching the celebration unfold. Daniel was surrounded by people congratulating him, but he kept looking over at his mother, making sure she saw him, making sure she knew this moment belonged to her as much as him. Victoria thought about the path that had led here. A single evening, a moment of being confronted with her own blindness and the choice to change instead of defend. It hadn't been easy. She still made mistakes. Just last week, she'd caught herself making assumptions about someone's background and had to consciously correct herself. But she was trying. Every day she was trying to see people as they actually were instead of as she assumed them to be. To listen to their stories instead of skipping past them to get to business. To recognize that success wasn't just about what you built, but about whether you built it at the expense of seeing the humanity in others. "What are you thinking about?" Rosa asked. Victoria smiled. "I'm thinking about how much I've learned from you and Daniel. How the most expensive education I ever got came from a 19-year-old pianist and his mother. And how the only cost was being willing to admit I'd been wrong. That's not a small cost," Rosa said. "Pride is expensive to give up. But worth it," Victoria said. "Completely worth it." The evening continued with more music, more stories, more connections. But Victoria's favorite moment came at the very end as people were leaving. The young boy who painted came up to her, shy and uncertain. "Mrs. Ashford, I just wanted to say thank you." Because of the scholarship, I can go to art school next year. I can actually become an artist instead of just dreaming about it. Victoria knelt down to his eye level. You were already an artist. The scholarship just gave you the tools to show everyone else what you already were. The boy smiled and ran back to his father. Rosa watched the exchange. See? You're learning. Victoria stood up, watching the families file out into the night, each one carrying hope that hadn't existed before. Each child holding dreams that now had a chance to become real. And Victoria realized that this right here was worth more than any business deal she'd ever closed. This was real success, not money or power or recognition, but the ability to see people clearly and help them become who they were meant to be. The lights in Lincoln Center began to dim. The gala was over, but the real work was just beginning.